December 11th, 1941. The Reichstag in Berlin. Adolf Hitler stands before a sea of Nazi officials, their faces illuminated by the cold winter light filtering through the Grand Hall's windows. 4 days earlier, the world had watched in horror as Japanese bombs rained down on Pearl Harbor, dragging America into a war it had desperately tried to avoid. Now, in this moment, Hitler is about to make a decision that will seal the fate of the Third Reich. He raises his hand. The room falls silent. What happens next defies all military logic. What happens next contradicts every strategic principle his own generals had advised. In the span of a single speech, Adolf Hitler will transform a European conflict into a truly global war. He will awaken a sleeping giant that possesses resources beyond imagination, an industrial capacity unmatched in human history, and a determination forged in the fires of democracy. This is the story of the day Hitler declared war on America, the day he made his biggest mistake, the day the outcome of World War II was decided, though few realized it at the time. The question that haunts history is simple yet profound. Why? Why would Hitler, already fighting the Soviet Union in a brutal campaign that was draining Germany's strength, voluntarily add the most powerful industrial nation on Earth to his list of enemies? Why would he gift Franklin D. Roosevelt the one thing the American president desperately needed but couldn't obtain on his own? A unified American public ready to fight. To understand this moment, we must go back. Back to the choices that led here. Back to the miscalculations, the hubris, and the fatal underestimation of American resolve. In the autumn of 1941, Adolf Hitler stood at what appeared to be the pinnacle of his power. Nazi Germany controlled most of continental Europe. From the Atlantic coast of France to the gates of Moscow, the swastika flew over conquered territories. Poland had fallen in weeks. France, the great military power of World War I, had collapsed in just 6 weeks. Yugoslavia, Greece, and much of the Balkans lay under German occupation. But beneath this surface of triumph, cracks were forming. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, launched on June 22, 1941, had not delivered the quick victory he had promised. The German Wehrmacht had expected to crush Soviet resistance in a matter of months, perhaps even weeks. Hitler himself had declared that they would kick in the door and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down. The door had been kicked, but the structure refused to fall. By December 1941, German forces were bogged down in the brutal Russian winter, their supply lines stretched to the breaking point. The Soviets, fighting with a desperation born of survival, had halted the German advance just miles from Moscow. Every day, thousands of German soldiers were dying in the frozen steppes, victims of both Soviet bullets and the merciless cold that turned tanks into frozen coffins and rifles into useless metal sticks. Hitler needed the war to remain limited. He needed time. He needed to avoid adding new enemies while he dealt with the ones he already had. Across the Atlantic Ocean, America watched the war with growing concern but official neutrality. President Franklin D. Roosevelt understood the threat Nazi Germany posed to the world, but the American public remained deeply divided. The trauma of World War I still haunted the nation. Millions of Americans had no desire to send their sons to die in another European war. Isolationist sentiment ran deep, particularly in the American Midwest and rural communities. Roosevelt had been walking a diplomatic tightrope for years. He supported Britain through the Lend-Lease program, supplying weapons and materials while technically maintaining neutrality. American destroyers escorted convoys partway across the Atlantic. American factories churned out tanks and planes that found their way to British and Soviet hands. But actual war? That required Congress to declare it, and Congress reflected a divided nation. Hitler knew this. His intelligence reports made it clear that America was not unified in its desire to fight. If he could avoid giving Roosevelt a reason to formally enter the war, perhaps America would remain on the sidelines long enough for Germany to consolidate its conquests in Europe and defeat the Soviet Union. This was the strategic situation on December 7, 1941, when Japanese carrier planes descended on Pearl Harbor. The attack on Pearl Harbor was devastating. In 2 hours, the Japanese Imperial Navy's carrier strike force sank or damaged 8 American battleships, destroyed hundreds of aircraft, and killed over 2,400 American servicemen. It was the worst military disaster in American history. But it was also a catastrophic strategic blunder by Japan. The attack united the American public overnight in a way that years of presidential speeches and diplomatic warnings never could. The debate about isolationism ended the moment the first bomb fell on the USS Arizona. On December 8, President Roosevelt addressed Congress. His voice, broadcast across the nation and around the world, declared December 7th a date which will live in infamy. Within hours, Congress declared war on Japan. The vote was nearly unanimous. Only one member of Congress voted against it. America was now at war. But here is the crucial point that many people today don't fully understand. America was only at war with Japan. The United States had not declared war on Germany. Germany had not declared war on the United States. Technically, legally, the two nations were not at war with each other, despite years of tension and proxy conflict. Roosevelt knew that defeating Japan, while necessary, was not sufficient to secure global democracy. The real existential threat was Nazi Germany. But asking Congress and the American people to declare war on Germany when Germany hadn't directly attacked American soil would be politically difficult and potentially divisive. Hitler had been handed an extraordinary strategic gift. He could have remained quiet. He could have maintained official neutrality with America, while America focused its fury on Japan. This would have allowed him to continue receiving supplies through neutral channels, avoided adding American industrial might to his enemies, and potentially kept America focused on the Pacific rather than Europe. His own generals and advisors urged him to do exactly this. Stay quiet. Let America and Japan exhaust each other. Keep the war in Europe separate from the war in the Pacific. Hitler chose differently. If you're enjoying this journey through history, remember to subscribe to WW2 Last Stand, where we bring forgotten battles, hidden stories, and untold final stands of World War II back to life. To understand why Hitler made the decision he did, we need to understand the man himself and the ideology that drove him. Adolf Hitler was not a cautious leader. He was not a man who carefully weighed diplomatic options and chose the path of prudent restraint. His entire career had been built on bold, aggressive gambles that defied conventional wisdom. The remilitarization of the Rhineland, the annexation of Austria, the seizure of Czechoslovakia, the invasion of Poland, the attack on France. Every time, his generals had warned him of disaster, and every time he had proven them wrong through sheer audacity and the weakness of his opponents. By December 1941, Hitler believed in his own myth of invincibility. He had convinced himself that his instincts were superior to military logic, that his will could overcome material reality. This hubris would prove fatal. But there were other factors at work as well. Hitler had signed the Tripartite Pact with Japan and Italy in September 1940. This agreement created what the Axis powers called the New Order, a division of the world into spheres of influence. The pact included a mutual defense clause. If any member was attacked by a nation not currently involved in the war, the others would come to their aid. Technically, this clause didn't apply to Pearl Harbor. Japan had attacked first. Japan was the aggressor. Germany had no legal obligation under the pact to declare war on America. But Hitler viewed the pact through the lens of ideology and personal loyalty, not legal technicality. He saw Japan as a powerful ally that was doing exactly what he had hoped, tying down American resources in the Pacific and challenging the Anglo-American world order he despised. In his twisted worldview, abandoning Japan would make Germany appear weak and untrustworthy to other potential allies. There was another factor, perhaps the most important one: Hitler's fundamental misunderstanding of America. Throughout his life, Hitler had absorbed and internalized racist ideology that warped his perception of reality. He viewed America as a mongrel nation, weakened by racial mixing, dominated by Jewish influence, and culturally decadent. He believed that democracy made nations soft and incapable of the harsh discipline required for modern warfare. He looked at American society, its emphasis on individual rights, its diverse population, its commercial culture, and saw weakness rather than strength. He could not comprehend what American leaders like George Marshall and Franklin Roosevelt understood instinctively: that American industrial capacity, when fully mobilized, would dwarf anything the world had ever seen. That American innovation, diversity of thought, and entrepreneurial spirit would translate into military advantage. That the very democratic values Hitler despised would become sources of strength when the nation united around a common purpose. Hitler also believed that the United States would inevitably enter the war against Germany anyway. American destroyers were already clashing with German U-boats in the Atlantic. American factories were supplying Britain and the Soviet Union. American pilots were volunteering to fly with the RAF. In Hitler's mind, a formal state of war already existed in everything but name. By declaring war first, Hitler believed he could control the narrative. He could present Germany as the victim of American aggression. He could inspire his own people and convince wavering allies that Germany was willing to stand up to the great powers of both East and West simultaneously. It was a calculation built entirely on delusion and hubris. On the morning of December 11, 1941, Hitler summoned the Reichstag. The assembled Nazi officials, party leaders, and military commanders filled the Grand Chamber, waiting to hear what their Führer would announce. Outside, Berlin was covered in snow. The German public was beginning to grasp the reality of the Eastern Front. The casualty lists were growing longer, the promises of quick victory sounding increasingly hollow. Food rationing was tightening. The war that was supposed to be over by autumn was now grinding into a second winter. Hitler took the podium. For 90 minutes he spoke. His speech ranged across grievances and justifications, historical revisionism, and conspiracy theories. He blamed Franklin Roosevelt for undermining peace, accused America of secretly waging war against Germany. Then came the moment that would change everything. Hitler declared that Germany was now at war with the United States of America. The Reichstag erupted in applause. Nazi officials leaped to their feet, arms raised in salute, shouting their approval. They believed they were witnessing a moment of strength, of German defiance against the world. They were actually witnessing the beginning of the end. Within hours, Benito Mussolini followed suit, declaring that Italy too was at war with America. The Axis powers had transformed a regional conflict into a truly global war. In Washington, D.C., Franklin Roosevelt received the news with something that witnesses described as grim satisfaction. Hitler had solved Roosevelt's political problem for him. The American president no longer needed to convince a skeptical Congress to declare war on Germany. Germany had declared war first. The path was now clear. On the same day, December 11, 1941, the United States Congress voted to recognize the state of war that Germany had declared. There was no debate. There was no opposition. The vote was unanimous. The day Hitler declared war on America had arrived. and with it, the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. The immediate military impact of America's entry into the war against Germany was minimal. It would take months for American forces to deploy to Europe in significant numbers. The first major American ground engagement against German forces wouldn't come until Operation Torch in North Africa in November 1942, nearly a year away. But the long-term strategic consequences were devastating for Germany, and absolutely certain. Consider the numbers. In 1941, Germany's entire war economy produced approximately 11,000 aircraft, 5,200 tanks, and 7,000 artillery pieces. These were impressive numbers, achieved through years of rearmament and total mobilization of German industry. By 1944, after America had fully mobilized its industrial base, the United States alone produced 96,000 aircraft, 17,000 tanks, and quantities of artillery, trucks, ships, and supplies that Germany could never hope to match. And this was just American production. It didn't include British, Soviet, or other Allied output. The disparity in naval power was even more stark. By the end of 1942, American shipyards were launching a new aircraft carrier every month and a new destroyer every week. The German surface navy, already vastly outnumbered, would spend most of the war trapped in port, unable to contest Allied control of the seas. But numbers alone don't capture the full picture. American entry into the war meant that Britain, which had been fighting alone for over a year, suddenly had a powerful ally with unlimited resources. It meant that the Soviet Union, bleeding and desperate on the Eastern Front, would receive not just weapons, but also trucks, trains, food, and raw materials through the Lend-Lease program. American Studebaker trucks would carry Soviet troops to Berlin. American Spam would feed the Red Army. American aviation fuel would power Soviet fighters. The bombing campaign against German cities and industry, which had been limited and ineffective in 1941, would intensify into a devastating strategic offensive. By 1944, American and British bombers would be dropping thousands of tons of explosives on German targets every single day, destroying factories, refineries, transportation networks, and the morale of the German people. Perhaps most importantly, Hitler had created exactly what he feared most: a unified coalition of capitalist democracies and communist Soviets, united by their common enemy. The ideological contradictions that divided America and the Soviet Union were real, but they would be set aside until Germany was defeated. Hitler's declaration of war had given this unnatural alliance, as he called it, a clarity of purpose it might never have achieved otherwise. German generals who survived the war would later write in their memoirs about December 11, 1941, as the day they knew Germany would lose. Not immediately, not without tremendous sacrifice and millions more deaths, but inevitably. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, when asked after the war when he first believed Germany would be defeated, pointed to this date. So did Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, who spent the rest of the war trying to squeeze more production from an economy that was being systematically destroyed from the air. The years following Hitler's declaration would prove his critics right in the most tragic way possible. In November 1942, American forces landed in North Africa, opening a new front that would eventually lead to the invasion of Italy and the collapse of Mussolini's regime. In June 1944, American, British, and Canadian forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, establishing the Western Front that Hitler's generals had dreaded. By early 1945, American and Soviet forces were racing toward Berlin from opposite directions. Throughout this period, the material superiority of the Allies, particularly American industrial production, made itself felt in every battle. German soldiers fought with skill and often desperate courage, but they were overwhelmed by enemies who had more tanks, more planes, more ammunition, more fuel, and more of everything that modern warfare required. The German military developed impressive new weapons in the later years of the war: jet aircraft, advanced submarines, rockets. But these technological achievements came too late and in quantities far too small to change the strategic balance. Germany was drowning in American steel and Soviet blood, and no amount of innovation could overcome such material disadvantage. In his bunker in Berlin, in the final days of April 1945, Hitler refused to accept responsibility for the catastrophe he had created. He blamed the German people for being too weak. He blamed his generals for being too cautious. He blamed fate, circumstance, and a worldwide conspiracy against him. What he never acknowledged was the obvious truth: that his decision to declare war on America in December 1941 had been the pivotal mistake from which everything else followed. That his hubris and racist ideology had blinded him to reality. That in trying to demonstrate strength, he had revealed and ensured his ultimate weakness. On April 30, 1945, as Soviet artillery pounded Berlin into rubble and American and British forces consolidated their control of Western Germany, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his underground bunker. 1 week later, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war Hitler had started would claim over 70 million lives worldwide. The Jewish population of Europe, targeted by Hitler's genocidal final solution, was nearly annihilated. 6 million men, women, and children murdered in concentration camps and killing fields. Tens of millions of civilians across Europe and Asia died from bombing, starvation, disease, and direct violence. The world that emerged from this catastrophe was fundamentally transformed. America and the Soviet Union emerged as superpowers. Europe, devastated and exhausted, would spend decades rebuilding. The colonial empires that had dominated the previous century began to crumble. The United Nations was established to prevent such a war from ever happening again. And in the ruins of Germany, the survivors asked themselves how it had all gone so wrong. How had a nation with such potential for greatness descended into such evil and ruin? Part of the answer lies in the character of the man who led them. Adolf Hitler was a leader whose charisma masked fundamental incompetence, whose confidence disguised fatal ignorance, whose will to power destroyed the very nation he claimed to serve. And on December 11, 1941, the day Hitler declared war on America, all of these flaws crystallized into a single catastrophic decision that would seal his fate and the fate of Nazi Germany. History offers few moments of such clear cause and effect. Few decisions where the consequences are so obvious in hindsight and where the mistake was so avoidable. Hitler didn't need to declare war on America. His treaty obligations were ambiguous at best. His military position was already precarious. His generals advised against it. Logic, strategy, and prudence all pointed in the opposite direction. But he did it anyway, because hubris and ideology blinded him to reality, because he believed his own propaganda about German superiority and American weakness, because he couldn't imagine a world where his will alone wasn't sufficient to reshape reality. The soldiers who fought and died in the years that followed, German, American, Soviet, British, and countless others, paid the price for this delusion. The civilians who perished in bombed cities, concentration camps, and war-torn countryside paid the price. Entire generations across the globe paid the price. We study these moments not to dwell on past horrors, but to learn from them. To understand how bad decisions by leaders can cascade into catastrophes for millions. To recognize the warning signs of authoritarian thinking and racist ideology before they lead to conflict. To appreciate the fragility of peace and the terrible costs of war. The day Hitler declared war on America was more than just a political mistake or a strategic blunder. It was a moment that revealed fundamental truths about the nature of power, the consequences of hubris, and the ultimate triumph of democratic values over authoritarian might, though that triumph came at an almost unbearable cost in human suffering. As we remember this pivotal moment in history, we honor the memory of those who fought against tyranny and those who perished in its shadow. Their sacrifice reminds us that freedom is never guaranteed, that vigilance is always necessary, and that the lessons of history must never be forgotten. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of World War II's most consequential moments. If you want to explore more forgotten battles, untold stories, and the final stands that shaped our world, make sure to watch our other videos here at WW2 Last Stand. Subscribe to continue uncovering the hidden moments that changed history forever. Remember the past, understand the present, protect the future.